A mountain man paid 10 cents for a cabin, then found a fat Amish bride hanging with a note. The wind howls through broken logs. A man, scarred by loss, thinks he's bought nothing but rotten timber in the high country. But inside the cabin, the rope creaks, and a young bride gasps for breath, a crumpled note pinned to her dress. Unwanted. God forgive me, he saves her life. But in her satchel lies a secret that binds them tighter than either can bear. She isn't just a stranger. By law, she's already his wife. And, as the church bell tolls, the railroad men thunder in with iron fists and guns, claiming the cabin isn't his at all. Now the outcast bride holds the one thing that could save them, or destroy everything. Can the mountain man and the unwanted bride fight for a home, for dignity, and for love, before the frontier swallows them whole? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Kenneth Boone shifted his weight on the weathered fence rail. The hard wood pressed against his worn trousers, but he barely noticed the discomfort. His attention stayed fixed on the auctioneer, a round-bellied man whose voice carried across the dusty courthouse yard. Next up, folks, we got ourselves a right peculiar offering, the auctioneer announced, mopping his brow with a red handkerchief. One abandoned claim up in Miller's Pass. Previous owner left behind what's left of a log cabin. Ain't much to look at, truth be told. Kenneth's heart quickened. Miller's Pass. He knew that country well from his trapping days. High elevation, good water, and most importantly, far from anywhere else. His calloused fingers touched the few coins in his pocket. The crowd of townspeople shuffled their boots in the dirt, their disinterest plain as day. Ladies in their Sunday best whispered behind gloved hands, while men in pressed suits shook their heads at the mention of such a worthless property. Opening bid at 50 cents, the auctioneer called out. Who will give me 50 cents for this fine piece of mountain real estate? Silence fell over the gathering. A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Surely someone sees the potential here. The auctioneer's voice took on a desperate edge. 30 cents? 20? Kenneth cleared his throat, drawing sideways glances from those nearest him. 10 cents, he said, his voice rough from disuse. The crowd turned to stare at him, taking in his threadbare coat and the weeks of beard on his hollow cheeks. Someone coughed, a sound that poorly disguised a laugh. 10 cents? The auctioneer blinked, then recovered his professional demeanor. We have 10 cents from the gentleman on the rail. 10 cents going once. Look at that mountain man, a woman's voice carried clearly. What's he want with a broken-down cabin? Probably the only company that'll have him, another answered, triggering more laughter. Kenneth kept his eyes forward, his expression unchanged. He'd grown used to such talk over the years since losing Sarah and little James to the pox. Folks didn't understand why a man might choose solitude over their so-called civilized company. Going twice, the auctioneer paused, searching the crowd hopefully, and sold, to the gentleman for 10 cents. More jeers followed as Kenneth made his way through the crowd to pay his dime. He felt their stares on his back as he signed the deed with careful letters, his penmanship still neat despite years of disuse. The clerk's nose wrinkled at his proximity, but Kenneth pretended not to notice. The sun had moved westward by the time he mounted his mule, Martha. She was a steady creature, not much to look at, but reliable on mountain trails. Kenneth adjusted his pack and rifle, then guided Martha away from the courthouse and the tittering crowd. The road leading out of town was rutted from recent rains and heavy wagon traffic. Martha picked her way carefully around the worst spots, her long ears flicking at the sound of an approaching wagon train. Kenneth guided her to the side of the road, watching as the line of covered wagons creaked past. Children's faces peered out from under canvas covers, their eyes wide at the sight of him. A memory flashed. James, at that age, asking endless questions about tracking and hunting. Kenneth pushed the thought away and touched his heels to Martha's flanks, urging her onward. The afternoon wore into evening. Dust from the wagon train hung in the air like a copper-colored veil, catching the dying sunlight. Kenneth's throat grew dry, but he waited until they were well away from town before stopping at a creek to water Martha and fill his canteen. As the sun touched the western peaks, Kenneth guided Martha off the main trail and into a stand of towering pines. The familiar scents of pine needles and mountain air eased something in his chest that had been tight all day. This was where he belonged, not down there with all those judging eyes and whispered words. He made camp with practiced efficiency, gathering dry wood and starting a small fire. Martha grazed nearby, the bell on her halter tinkling softly in the gathering dusk. Kenneth pulled out his knife and whetstone, settling back against his saddle. The rhythmic sound of stone on steel filled the growing darkness. His hands knew the motion without thought, leaving his mind free to wander. It had been 5 years since the pox took his family. 5 years of wandering the high country, trapping and trading just enough to get by. The cabin might not be much, but it would be a place to call his own again. Lord, he whispered into the darkness, more habit than conviction. I ain't sure you're listening anymore. But if you are, he paused, the whetstone still in his hand. Well, I reckon you know what's in my heart better than I do. The stars emerged one by one, filling the sky with their cold, distant light. Kenneth set aside his knife and leaned back, studying the familiar patterns above. The Big Dipper pointed true north, just as it had all of those nights he'd shown it to James. His son would be 12 now if he'd lived, old enough to learn proper tracking and hunting. A coyote called from somewhere in the darkness, its lonely voice echoing off distant ridges. Kenneth pulled his blanket closer, feeling the night's chill settle in. Hope and memory warred in his heart. Hope for what this cabin might become, haunted by memories of what he'd lost. He closed his eyes but didn't sleep, listening to the night sounds and Martha's occasional movements. Tomorrow would bring him closer to Miller's Pass and whatever remained of the cabin. 10 cents might not buy much in town, but up here in the high country, it could buy a man a fresh start. Whether he deserved one or not, remained to be seen. Kenneth touched the small Bible in his coat pocket, a habit he hadn't broken even after all these years. Sarah had given it to him on their wedding day, her name written inside in careful script. He hadn't opened it since burying her and James, but he couldn't bring himself to leave it behind either. The fire burned down to coals, casting a faint red glow across his campsite. An owl called from the darkness, its question unanswered. Kenneth stared up at the stars, counting the familiar constellations until their patterns blurred together. Half-formed hopes mixed with old griefs in his heart, neither fully winning out over the other. Martha's bell tinkled softly as she settled down for the night. Kenneth pulled his blanket tighter and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead, marking time in their ancient dance. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. For now the mountain night wrapped around him like an old friend, neither demanding nor judging, simply allowing him to be. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Kenneth broke camp. Martha nickered softly while he secured his bedroll and saddlebags, her breath making small clouds in the crisp mountain air. The familiar routine of morning on the trail settled over him like a well-worn coat. Check the mule's hooves, scatter the ashes from last night's fire, ensure nothing was left behind. The rising sun warmed his back as they made their way up the winding trail toward Miller's Pass. Scrub oak and juniper gave way to tall pines, their shadows stretching across the path. Martha's hooves kicked up small puffs of dust with each careful step. The air grew thinner as they climbed, carrying the sharp scent of pine sap and wild sage. Around mid-morning, the quiet rhythm of their journey broke. The sharp ring of metal on metal echoed through the trees, followed by men's voices. Kenneth drew Martha to a halt, listening. The sounds grew clearer as they rounded a bend in the trail. A survey crew spread across the mountainside, their red and white stakes dotting the landscape like strange flowers. 6 men in canvas work clothes moved with purpose, hammering markers into the rocky soil. Their equipment gleamed in the morning sun. Brass transit levels, steel chains for measuring, and polished wooden stakes waiting to be driven into the earth. As Kenneth approached, a tall man in a better-cut coat straightened up from examining a map spread across a portable table. The foreman, by his bearing and the way the others deferred to him. His neat mustache twitched as he sized up Kenneth and Martha. "Hold up there, friend," the foreman called out, rolling up his map with precise movements. You'll want to know about the railway coming through." Kenneth reined Martha to a stop, though every instinct urged him to push past without engaging. "Much obliged for the warning," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "But I've got business up at Miller's Pass." The foreman's expression shifted to something like pity. "That old heap? Better save yourself the trouble. This whole section's been marked for the railway. Progress is coming, friend, whether folks are ready or not." He gestured at the stakes dotting the mountainside. 6 months from now, this'll all be swallowed up by the line. No place up here for holdouts anymore. Kenneth felt something cold settle in his stomach but kept his face still. "Reckon that's between me and whatever's left of that cabin," he said quietly. "Good day to you." He touched his heels to Martha's flanks, moving past the survey crew without another word. The rhythmic sound of their hammering followed him up the trail, each strike like a nail in the lid of something precious and wild. The sun climbed higher as they pushed on, the air growing thinner and cooler. Kenneth's thoughts churned like leaves in a stream. He'd known the railway was coming, everyone did, but hearing it stated so plainly, seeing those stakes marking its path through the wilderness made it more real than he'd wanted to admit. By late afternoon, the trail opened into a small clearing. Kenneth drew Martha to a halt, taking in his first view of the property he'd bought for 10 cents. The cabin slouched against the mountainside, its log walls gray with age and weather. The roof sagged in the middle where snow load had taken its toll. One window remained, dark and empty as a dead man's eye. But something wasn't right. Kenneth felt it before his mind caught up to what his eyes were seeing. There, in the doorway, something swaying slightly in the mountain breeze. A rope, and at its end, a figure. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed, already swinging down from the saddle. His boots hit the ground running. The hanging woman wore a plain dress and bonnet, Amish by her clothing. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, stout in build. Her face had begun to turn blue. Kenneth's knife was in his hand without conscious thought, and he reached up to saw through the rope where it crossed the doorway beam. The woman's weight dropped into his arms, nearly taking them both to the ground. He lowered her carefully onto the packed earth, fingers fumbling at her neck for a pulse. Her skin was warm. She couldn't have been hanging long. Kenneth had seen death enough to know sometimes there was still a chance if you acted fast enough. He tilted her head back, checked her airway, and began the rhythmic pressing on her chest he'd learned years ago from an army doctor. "Come on," he muttered, continuing the steady compressions. "Breathe." Seconds stretched like hours. Then suddenly she convulsed, a racking cough tearing from her throat. Kenneth quickly turned her onto her side as she gasped and retched, drawing in great gulping breaths between spasms. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear warring in their depths. She tried to speak but could only manage another bout of coughing. Kenneth noticed something then, a piece of paper, crumpled and damp with sweat, that had been tucked into the collar of her dress. With gentle fingers, he retrieved the note and smoothed it open. The handwriting was neat but shaky, as if written in great distress. "Unwanted. God forgive me. I cannot go back." The woman's coughing had subsided to ragged breathing. She stared up at him, her eyes now showing a mix of shame and something like anger. Whether at him for interfering or at herself, he couldn't tell. Evening shadows were beginning to stretch across the clearing. The woman tried to sit up, but her arms shook too badly to support her weight. Kenneth steadied her with a careful hand on her shoulder. "Easy now," he said softly, the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "Take your time." She drew another shuddering breath. "Why?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from the rope's damage. "Why did you—" "Because life ain't ours to throw away," Kenneth answered, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice, "no matter how dark things seem." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down cheeks still mottled from the rope's embrace. Her hands trembled like aspen leaves in a storm. Kenneth kept his steady grip on her shoulder, anchoring her to the present moment, to the simple fact of her continued breathing. The sun touched the western peaks, painting the clearing in long shadows and golden light. A cool breeze stirred the pines, carrying the first hints of evening chill. Martha stood where he'd left her, reins dragging, watching them with patient eyes. The woman's trembling slowly began to ease, though her breathing remained uneven. Kenneth could feel the tension in her shoulder beneath his hand. The way she held herself like something might shatter if she moved too quickly. He knew that feeling, had lived with it daily in those first months after losing Sarah and James. The feeling that the world might crack apart if you let yourself fully inhabit it again. The evening light faded around them as they sat in that strange tableau. The mountain man and the Amish woman he'd cut down from his doorway. The note's words heavy between them. Unwanted. God forgive me. I cannot go back. Kenneth kept his hand steady on her shoulder as the shadows lengthened, offering what anchor he could against the storm he could feel raging behind her careful stillness. They would need to move soon, find shelter, tend to her injuries, face whatever came next. But for now, he simply sat with her, watching the day's last light paint the western sky in colors no painter could capture, while somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called its evening song. Kenneth gathered fallen branches from around the clearing, his movements careful and deliberate to avoid startling the woman who sat huddled against the cabin wall. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, leaving a purple twilight that made everything look soft and strange. His hands worked automatically, arranging kindling and striking his flint, while his mind churned over the events that had led to this moment. The spark caught and soon a small flame flickered to life. He fed it carefully, adding larger sticks as the fire grew stronger. The woman watched him through half-closed eyes, her throat bearing angry red marks from the rope. Kenneth's stomach twisted at the sight. "Here," he said softly, pulling his canteen from his saddlebag. "Small sips now." She accepted the canteen with trembling hands following his instruction. After she'd taken a few careful swallows, her breathing seemed to ease somewhat. "My name is Miriam," she whispered, her voice rough and painful sounding. "Miriam Zook." Kenneth nodded, settling himself on the other side of the fire. "Kenneth Boone," he offered in return, "though I reckon you weren't expecting company up here." A bitter smile touched her lips. "No, I wasn't expecting anything more." She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "My father." Her voice caught, and she had to take another sip of water before continuing. "He tried to trade me. Like cattle. To our neighbor Eli Yoder. For his Southfield." Kenneth felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen plenty of ugly things in his years on the frontier, but treating one's own child like property struck him as particularly vile. "The whole community?" Miriam's voice wavered. "They laughed. Called me the prize heifer." Her hands clutched at her skirts. "I've always been larger than the other girls. But the way they spoke of me?" Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Kenneth reached into his pack and pulled out some dried jerky. "Here. You need to keep up your strength." He passed it across the fire to her, noting how her hands still shook. Miriam accepted the offering, taking small, careful bites. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks dancing upward into the darkening sky. After a while, she continued her story. "I joined a wagon train heading west, told them I was a widow." Her voice was barely above a whisper now. "But after 3 weeks I couldn't bear the loneliness anymore, the stares, the whispers." She looked around the clearing. "I saw this cabin marked on a trader's map. Thought it would be as good a place as any to." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The temperature was dropping rapidly now that night had fallen. Kenneth glanced at the cabin's dark interior. "We should move inside. It's not much, but it'll keep the wind off." Miriam nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, and she leaned heavily against him as they made their way inside. Kenneth carried the lamp he'd lit from the fire, its warm glow revealing the cabin's sorry state. The roof had held better than it looked from outside, though, and one corner remained relatively dry and clean. As Kenneth helped Miriam settle onto his bedroll, she reached for a leather satchel she'd dropped earlier. Her hands trembled as she withdrew a folded document. "There's something," she swallowed hard, "something you should see." Kenneth took the paper, holding it close to the lamplight. The legal language was dense, but certain phrases jumped out at him. Marriage contract, and binding upon purchase of property, and signed and witnessed this day. His eyes found the signatures at the bottom. Miriam's father, a justice of the peace, and a space for the property buyer. The property buyer, the man who'd purchased the cabin for 10 cents, Kenneth Boone. He stared at the document, reading it again to be sure he understood. According to this paper, his purchase of the cabin had also purchased him a wife. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "I didn't know," Miriam said quickly, her voice tight with anxiety. "Not until after you saved me. I found it in my father's papers before I left. He must have arranged it all beforehand, knowing someone would claim the property eventually." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I'll leave at first light. I won't hold you to this trap." Kenneth shook his head, still trying to process this twist of fate. "You can't travel alone, not in these mountains. There's bears, mountain lions, bandits." He folded the paper carefully, handed it back to her. "Not to mention that railway crew down below." A coyote howled in the distance, answered by its pack. The sound echoed off the mountainsides, wild and lonely. Miriam shivered. "We'll figure this out come morning," Kenneth said firmly. "For now, you need rest." He moved to the opposite corner of the cabin, spreading his coat on the rough floorboards. "I'll sleep over here." Miriam clutched her satchel to her chest, looking small despite her size. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Kenneth nodded, settling onto his coat. The coyotes called again, their voices rising and falling in an ancient song. He listened to Miriam's breathing slowly even out as exhaustion claimed her, while his own mind raced with thoughts of this unexpected turn of events. The lamp burned low, casting dancing shadows on the cabin's walls. Outside, the night wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, the coyotes sang their wild chorus to the stars. Kenneth lay awake for a long time, wondering what twist of fate or divine providence had brought them both to this place, this moment, and what tomorrow might bring. Morning crept into the cabin through gaps in the weathered shutters, painting stripes of golden light across the dusty floor. Kenneth had been awake since before dawn, his years of mountain living making early rising as natural as breathing. He stood in the doorway now, studying the clearing with a critical eye. The cabin needed work, lots of it, if anyone was going to stay here through winter. The thought caught him off guard. He hadn't planned on staying, hadn't planned on anything beyond finding some peace in these mountains. Yet here he was, considering winter preparations. Behind him, he heard Miriam stirring on his bedroll, and the sound pushed him into motion. Outside, Kenneth found a rusty axe head near the woodpile. After an hour of work with his knife and a smooth stone, he had it sharp enough to bite into wood. He fitted it onto a sturdy handle he'd cut from an ash sapling, testing its balance before swinging it at a fallen log. The rhythmic thunk of axe meeting wood filled the clearing. Kenneth lost himself in the familiar work, his muscles remembering patterns learned long ago. Split logs began to pile up beside him, their fresh-cut surfaces gleaming in the morning light. The cabin door creaked open and Miriam emerged, squinting in the brightness. She moved carefully, one hand pressed against her throat where the rope had left its angry marks. Kenneth paused in his work, watching as she made her way to where he'd left his cooking gear. "You don't need to," he started, but she shook her head. "Please," she said, her voice still rough. "Let me be useful." She knelt by the cold fire pit, arranging kindling with trembling hands. Kenneth returned to his splitting, but kept one eye on her progress. She struggled with the flint and steel, but persisted until a spark caught. Soon, a small fire blazed beneath the coffee pot. The familiar smell of brewing coffee drifted across the clearing, mixing with the sharp scent of fresh-cut wood. "I'll be leaving today," Miriam announced suddenly, her words carrying clearly over the sound of his axe. "I've imposed enough." Kenneth drove his axe into a stump and walked over to where she knelt by the fire. Her hands shook as she tried to pour coffee into his battered tin cup, sloshing the hot liquid over the sides. "You can barely stand," he said quietly, taking the pot from her before she could burn herself. "These mountains ain't kind to folks traveling alone." "I can't stay." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That paper, what my father did, it's not right to trap you like this." Kenneth poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to her. "No, it ain't right. But neither is sending you out there alone." He gestured toward the wilderness beyond the clearing. "Let me at least ride you to the stage stop. It's 2 days' journey, but, The thunder of approaching hooves cut him off. Kenneth set down his cup and moved to stand between Miriam and the trail leading up to the cabin. 3 riders emerged from the trees, a well-dressed man in a dark suit flanked by 2 deputies, their badges glinting in the morning sun. The suited man reined his horse to a stop, dust billowing around the animal's hooves. He pulled a leather case from his saddlebag and extracted several folded papers. "Kenneth Boone?" The man's voice carried the clipped tones of Eastern education. When Kenneth nodded, he continued, "I'm Thomas Wheeler, agent for the Western Pacific Railroad Company." He shook out one of the papers, revealing a survey map marked with bold lines and official stamps. "I'm here to inform you that this structure," he gestured at the cabin with evident distaste, "sits on land designated for our new mountain route." Kenneth stood his ground. "Bought this place fair and square at county auction yesterday morning." Wheeler's polite mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. The county had no right to sell what wasn't theirs. This entire section was deeded to the railroad months ago. He produced another document. "I have the papers right here." "Seems to me," Kenneth said slowly, "that if the railroad owned it, they should have spoke up at the auction." Wheeler's face flushed. "The sale was unauthorized and therefore void. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises before we begin clearing the land." "I paid for this place." Kenneth's voice remained steady, but his hand drifted toward the knife at his belt. "Got papers of my own to prove it." The deputies tensed, hands moving to their gun belts. Wheeler's lips curved in a cold smile. 24 hours, Mr. Boone. After that, we'll remove you ourselves." He turned his horse, then paused. "Oh, and do inform your companion that harboring fugitives from justice is a serious offense." Miriam gasped softly behind Kenneth. Wheeler's smile widened before he spurred his horse and rode away, the deputies following close behind. The clearing seemed too quiet after they'd gone. Kenneth turned to find Miriam standing, her face pale but determined. "I have to leave," she said. "They'll use me against you. If my father reported me missing." "No." Kenneth's voice was firm. "That agent was just trying to scare us off." Besides, he looked at the cabin, at the fresh-cut wood piled nearby. "A man's got a right to defend what's his." Miriam wrung her hands. "But the railroad, they're so powerful. They'll bring more men, maybe even soldiers." "Maybe so." Kenneth picked up his axe again, "but first I aim to fix that roof." The rest of the morning passed in steady work. Kenneth climbed onto the cabin's roof, replacing rotted boards and patching holes while Miriam moved below, sweeping decades of dust and debris from the cabin's single room. They worked mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, broken only by the tap of Kenneth's hammer and the swish of Miriam's broom. As afternoon shadows lengthened, savory smells began drifting up from where Miriam had hung a pot over the fire. She'd found dried beans and salt pork in Kenneth's saddlebags, supplemented with wild onions she'd discovered growing near the cabin's back wall. The combination made Kenneth's stomach growl. He couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for him. He hammered the last shingle into place just as the sun touched the western peaks. Climbing down, he found Miriam stirring the pot of stew, her movements more sure now than they had been that morning. She'd tied back her hair with a faded ribbon, and color had returned to her cheeks. For the first time in years, smoke rose from the cabin's stone chimney, carrying the promise of a hot meal and shelter from the gathering evening. Kenneth paused, struck by how the scene stirred something in his chest, something he'd thought long buried with his family. Miriam looked up from her cooking, caught him watching. A blush colored her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Supper's nearly ready," she said softly, if you're staying to eat." Kenneth nodded, moving to wash up at the water barrel. "Reckon I am." The stew was simple but filling, and they ate in companionable silence as dusk settled over the mountains. Through the gathering darkness, Kenneth could see Miriam stealing glances at him, her expression troubled. He knew she was thinking about Wheeler's threats, about her father's machinations, about all the complications that had brought them to this moment. He was thinking about them too, but he was also thinking about how the cabin already felt different with 2 people in it instead of 1. How the lamplight seemed warmer somehow, and how the chill mountain air carried just a hint of hope on its evening breeze. The mountain air grew sharper as autumn crept into the high country. Morning frost traced delicate patterns on fallen leaves, and the aspens turned to gold against the dark evergreens. Kenneth and Miriam settled into a rhythm as natural as the changing seasons. Each dawn found Kenneth outside, axe in hand, while the sound of Miriam's quiet movements drifted through the cabin's newly repaired walls. The steady thunk of his blade against spruce trunks echoed through the clearing, mixing with bird song and the rustling of wind through yellowing leaves. One crisp morning, Kenneth paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. The pile of cut logs beside the cabin had grown impressive, enough to see them through the coming winter, if they stayed. If. The word caught in his mind like a splinter. He hadn't planned on staying, hadn't planned on having anyone to stay with. The cabin door creaked open, and Miriam emerged carrying his tin coffee cup. Steam rose from it in the morning air as she carefully picked her way across the clearing. She'd tied her apron more securely around her stout frame, and her steps were steady now, nothing like the trembling woman he'd found hanging from his doorway just weeks ago. "Much obliged," he said, accepting the cup. The coffee was hot and strong, the way he liked it. She'd learned his preferences without him having to say a word. "The quilt's coming along," she said, gesturing back toward the cabin. "Found some good pieces in that trunk you brought up from town." Kenneth nodded. He'd traded 2 deer hides for the trunk of cloth scraps, watching how Miriam's eyes had lit up at the sight of the colorful fabrics. Now she spent her evenings piecing them together by lamplight, her needle flashing silver in the dim light. Their days fell into a pattern. Kenneth worked outside, cutting wood, mending fences, hunting when meat ran low. Miriam kept the cabin, her quiet industry transforming the once bare room into something that almost felt like home. She hung dried herbs from the rafters, laid fresh swept rushes on the floor, and worked steadily on her quilt. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Kenneth carved wooden spoons and bowls, the shavings curling away from his knife like pale ribbons. Miriam read from her worn Bible, her voice soft but clear in the firelit quiet. Sometimes Kenneth found himself listening despite himself, hearing comfort in the ancient words he'd turned away from after burying his family. Word spread through the scattered homesteads and mining camps about the odd pair up in the high country. Travelers on the road would slow their wagons, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the fat Amish bride and her wild-looking mountain man. Their whispers carried on the wind. "Poor thing trapped up here with that rough fellow. Heard her own pa sold her off with the cabin deed. Well, who else would take her, size she is?" Miriam never seemed to hear them, but Kenneth noticed how she would straighten her spine, lift her chin just a little higher when anyone passed. Her quiet dignity made something twist in his chest, pride maybe, or admiration. One Sunday morning, as autumn's chill deepened toward winter, Kenneth cleared his throat over breakfast. "Thought we might go to services," he said, not meeting Miriam's startled gaze. "Town church ain't far. Could be there by 10 if we start soon." Miriam's hand stilled on her coffee cup. "Are you certain? People will talk." "Let 'em." He stood, brushing crumbs from his beard. "Best put on your Sunday clothes if you're willing." An hour later, they made their way down the mountain trail, Kenneth leading his mule while Miriam rode side saddle, her dark dress neat and pressed. She'd pinned her hair carefully under her white prayer cap. The wisps escaped to dance around her face in the morning breeze. The little church sat at the edge of town, its white-painted walls bright in the autumn sun. As they approached, Kenneth saw heads turn, heard the murmur of voices. Miriam's hands tightened on the mule's reins, but she kept her face serene. He helped her down, conscious of how every eye watched them climb the church steps. The whispers followed them inside, rising and falling like wind through dry grass. "Did you see? The mountain man and his Amish woman? Size of her, Lord have mercy, probably couldn't find no proper husband." Kenneth felt Miriam stiffen beside him, but she walked steadily to an empty pew, settling herself with quiet grace. He sat beside her, uncomfortably aware of his rough clothes and untrimmed beard among the townspeople's Sunday finery. Pastor John Avery met them at the church door after the service, his weathered face creasing in a genuine smile. "Welcome, friends. It does my heart good to see new faces in the congregation." Some of the tension eased from Miriam's shoulders at his kind tone. "Thank you, Pastor." It was a beautiful service. Indeed it was, Kenneth found himself saying, though in truth he'd barely heard the sermon over the constant whispers and stares. As they made their way back to the mule, a group of town women passed close by, their skirts swishing importantly. "Shameful," one muttered just loud enough to hear. "That poor girl trapped up there with him, and her so unfortunate looking." Miriam's step never faltered. She waited patiently while Kenneth helped her mount, then sat straight and tall as they rode away from the church, from the stares and whispers and judgment. They were halfway up the mountain trail when Kenneth finally spoke. "I'm sorry. Shouldn't have suggested coming to town." "No." Miriam's voice was firm. "I'm glad we went. God's house should be open to all his children, even those others find unfortunate looking." A smile touched her lips, gentle but unwavering. Kenneth glanced at her, struck by the quiet strength in her face. "Don't reckon I've been much of a child of God these past years," he admitted. "Not since." He trailed off, the old grief catching in his throat. "Since your family died?" Miriam asked softly. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. They rode in silence while the sun climbed higher, dappling the trail with autumn light. "Haven't said a proper prayer since I buried them," he finally continued. Seemed no point, with God not listening. Miriam was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was gentle, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "God didn't die when they did, Kenneth." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stopped the mule, turned to look at her fully. She met his gaze steadily, her eyes full of a compassion that held no pity, only understanding. "He was there," she continued softly, "in the hands that dug their graves, in the neighbors who brought food, in the sunrise that came even on your darkest morning. He's here now, in this mountain air, in the roof you fixed, in the bread I bake." She smiled, small but real. "Even in those whispers back there, they remind us that God's love doesn't depend on what others think of us." Kenneth stood very still, feeling something shift inside him, like ice breaking up on a spring river, painful but necessary. Miriam waited quietly, letting him find his way through it. Finally, he took up the mule's reins again. They continued up the trail, the only sound their mounts' steady hoofbeats and the wind in the autumn leaves. But the silence felt different now, filled with something that might have been peace or hope, or the first stirrings of faith returned from a long winter. The cabin came into view as the sun passed its zenith. Smoke rose straight and true from the chimney. Miriam had banked the morning fire carefully before they left. The sight of it struck Kenneth suddenly. This place that had been just shelter was becoming home, transformed by quiet strength and unwavering faith. Inside, Miriam hung her Sunday bonnet on a peg while Kenneth built up the fire. Neither spoke of the whispers, the stares, the judgment they'd faced in town. Instead, they moved through their familiar evening routine, Miriam setting soup to warm, while Kenneth brought in fresh wood for the night. As darkness gathered outside, they took their usual places by the fire. Kenneth's knife flashed as he worked on a new spoon, while Miriam's needle dipped and rose through the pieces of her quilt. After a while, she began to read from her Bible, her voice soft but clear in the firelit quiet. Kenneth's hand stilled on his carving as he listened. The words were familiar. He'd heard them countless times in his younger days, but somehow they sounded different now, falling like gentle rain on parched ground. He watched Miriam's face in the flickering light, saw the peace there despite everything she'd endured, and felt something long frozen begin to thaw in his own heart. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps God hadn't died with his family after all. Perhaps he had been here all along, waiting in the quiet moments, in the morning frost and evening fires, in the strength of a woman who faced ridicule with dignity, and in the slow healing of a heart he'd thought beyond mending. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains like a heavy wool blanket, bringing with them the first real autumn storm. The rain started as gentle drops but quickly grew into a steady drumbeat against the cabin's weathered roof. Kenneth stood in the doorway watching the sky darken further as afternoon faded into an early dusk. He could smell the wet earth and pine, along with something sweeter, fresh bread dough rising by the hearth. Inside, Miriam worked at the rough-hewn table, her strong hands kneading the day's second batch of dough. Flour dusted her apron and arms, and a few strands of hair had escaped her cap to curl damply around her face. The steady rhythm of her movements matched the rain's pattern overhead. A sudden gust of wind drove water through a gap in the roof boards, sending drops pattering onto the floor. Kenneth grabbed his tools and headed for the ladder he'd propped against the wall earlier that morning. "Mind the bread while I fix that leak," he said, already climbing. Miriam nodded, not breaking her rhythm. "There's another spot above the shelf," she called after him. "Been catching drops in a pot since sunrise." Kenneth pushed open the trapdoor to the roof, ducking his head against the driving rain. The old shingles were slick under his boots as he worked his way carefully across them. He could see where water had worked its way between the weathered boards, creating dark streaks in the wood. As he began nailing fresh shingles into place, his thoughts drifted to the coming winter. The cabin would need more work before the heavy snows came. Below, Miriam shaped her dough into round loaves, her movements sure and practiced. The familiar task usually brought her peace, but today, her hands trembled slightly as they worked the soft mass. She'd been carrying a weight into these past weeks, one that grew heavier with each passing day. The folded paper in her apron pocket seemed to burn against her hip, demanding attention. Kenneth's boots thumped overhead as he moved to patch another leak. The sound steadied her somewhat. In the weeks since he'd cut her down from that rope, he'd shown nothing but quiet kindness. Still, her heart fluttered with anxiety. What she had to tell him could change everything. The rain drummed harder as Kenneth finished the repairs and made his way back down the ladder, shaking water from his hair like a dog. Miriam handed him a rough towel without comment, then turned to slide the bread into the oven. The familiar domestic moment felt suddenly fragile. "Kenneth," she said softly, still facing the oven, "there's something I need to tell you." He paused in drying his face, watching her carefully. "What is it?" Miriam's hands twisted in her apron as she turned to face him. "Before I left Pennsylvania, my father," she swallowed hard, "he filed a land deed in my name." Kenneth's brow furrowed. "A deed? For what land?" With trembling fingers, Miriam withdrew the folded paper from her pocket. She'd carried it with her all the way from home, through her darkest moments, to this rain-washed afternoon. For this land, the cabin, the spring, all of it. Kenneth took the document with careful hands, unfolding it slowly. His eyes moved across the formal writing, taking in the official stamps and signatures. The paper was crisp despite its journey, protected by Miriam's careful handling. "Your father filed this before you left?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Miriam nodded, her throat tight. "He meant to control my future, I think, to make sure I couldn't." She trailed off, remembering the suffocating weight of her father's plans for her life. "But it means the land is mine. Legally mine." Kenneth was very still, the paper hanging loose in his hands. "Then my dime at auction bought nothing but these walls," he said quietly. "I'm sorry," Miriam whispered, her voice catching. "I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid." The words stuck in her throat. Afraid he'd send her away. Afraid he'd be angry. Afraid of losing this fragile piece they'd built between them. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady drum of rain and the crackle of the hearth fire. Kenneth studied the deed for a long moment more, then carefully refolded it. When he finally looked up, his eyes were clear and steady. "Then the land's safer in your hands than mine," he said simply. Miriam stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. "Well, what?" "The railroad men," Kenneth explained, handing the deed back to her. "They think they're dealing with just a mountain man who paid a dime for a broken-down cabin. But you," a slight smile touched his beard, "you've got proper papers." "Legal claim. Makes things harder for them." Relief washed through Miriam so strongly her knees nearly buckled. She clutched the paper to her chest, blinking back tears. "You're not angry?" Kenneth's face softened. "No, Miriam. Not angry." He gestured to the cabin around them. "You've made this place more of a home in a few weeks than I could have in years. Maybe it's right that it's yours by law as well as labor." The bread in the oven filled the cabin with its warm, yeasty smell. Outside, the rain continued its steady fall, but the tension that had filled the room began to ease. Miriam tucked the deed carefully back into her pocket and wiped her eyes with her apron. "I should check the bread," she said, her voice steadier now. Kenneth nodded, moving to add wood to the fire. They settled into their evening routine, Miriam tending to the baking while Kenneth dried his tools and set them in order. The familiar dance of their movements around the cabin's small space felt different now, somehow both more certain and more delicate. As night drew in, they took their usual places by the hearth. Miriam served fresh bread with the last of the morning's coffee, the warm loaf filling the air with comfort. Kenneth carved quietly at a piece of wood, his knife making soft, scratching sounds in the peaceful quiet. "What will you do?" he asked finally, not looking up from his work. With the land being yours? Miriam considered the question carefully, her hands folded in her lap. Stay, she said at last. If that's agreeable to you. Kenneth's knife paused in its motion. It's your choice now, he reminded her gently. Yes. Miriam's voice grew stronger. And I choose to stay. To make something of this place. She looked around the cabin, at the patches of new roof showing between the beams, the rising bread dough covered by her grandmother's cloth, the quilt she'd been mending draped over a chair. Something good. Outside, the rain began to slacken, its heavy drumbeat softening to a gentle patter. Through gaps in the clouds, a cold moon peeked through, casting silver light through the cabin's small window. The light caught the gleam of Kenneth's knife, the shine of Miriam's needle, the soft glow of contentment on both their faces. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned low, each lost in their own thoughts but somehow more connected than before. The revelation of the deed hung between them not as a barrier, but as a bridge. One more truth shared, one more step toward whatever they were slowly becoming. The moon climbed higher, its light growing stronger as the clouds continued to part. Inside the cabin, the bread cooled on its shelf, the fire settled to coals, and two people who had started as strangers found themselves sharing something that felt remarkably like peace. The autumn days grew shorter as Kenneth and Miriam fell into an easy rhythm at the homestead. Each morning brought new tasks, but they faced them together with growing comfort in each other's presence. The sound of Kenneth's axe rang through the crisp air as he split logs for winter, his steady strikes marking time like a heartbeat for their small piece of land. Miriam had cleared a patch of earth near the cabin's south wall, her strong hands working the soil until it was ready for planting. She knelt in the freshly turned earth, carefully placing carrot seeds in neat rows. The work was familiar, reminding her of gardens back home, but here it felt different. Here, she was planting for herself, for their future. Kenneth paused in his wood splitting to watch her. She had tied her apron up around her waist, the morning sun catching in her bonnet as she worked. There was something graceful about the way she moved, something sure and steady that made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar warmth. The soil looks good, he called over, leaning on his axe handle. Should grow fine carrots. Miriam looked up, shielding her eyes. I hope so, and beans too, if the Lord's willing. She patted the earth gently around another seed. We'll need the stores for winter. The word we hung in the air between them, natural and right in a way neither had expected. Kenneth nodded and returned to his chopping, hiding a small smile in his beard. By midday, the sun had warmed the clearing considerably. Miriam wiped her brow and headed inside to check on her bread dough. She'd set it to rise earlier, tucked in a warm corner near the hearth. As she lifted the cloth covering, her eyes widened. Oh my, she exclaimed, staring at the overflow of dough that had escaped its pan and was still climbing. Kenneth appeared in the doorway at her cry, axe in hand. What's wrong? Miriam gestured helplessly at the expanding mass. I must have used too much yeast. Or perhaps the warmth. She trailed off as Kenneth's deep chuckle filled the cabin. Reckon that's the most enthusiastic bread I've ever seen, he said, setting his axe aside and moving closer to inspect the situation. Miriam tried to maintain her dismay, but Kenneth's amusement was infectious. A giggle escaped her, then another, until she was laughing openly. It's like it's trying to take over the whole cabin. Kenneth reached out and poked the dough with one finger, leaving a small dent that quickly filled itself in. This sent Miriam into fresh peals of laughter. She hadn't laughed like this in years, free and unguarded, her whole body shaking with it. Well, Kenneth said, his eyes twinkling, least we won't go hungry today. They managed to wrangle the exuberant dough into submission, though it still produced the largest loaf either had ever seen. The smell of baking bread filled the cabin as the afternoon waned, mixing with the sharp scent of pine from Kenneth's woodpile and the earthy smell of Miriam's garden soil. As dusk approached, they sat together at the rough-hewn table, sharing thick slices of the oversized bread with butter and honey. Kenneth noticed Miriam's shawl had come loose at one corner, the yarn unraveling where it had caught on a nail. Here, he said, reaching for it, let me fix that for you. Miriam's eyes widened slightly as she handed over the worn garment. You can mend? Kenneth retrieved a needle and thread from Miriam's sewing basket. My ma taught me, said every mountain man should know how to keep his gear sound. He threaded the needle with more confidence than finesse, his large fingers making the simple task look complicated. Miriam watched as he began to work, his brow furrowed in concentration. His stitches were large and uneven, nothing like her own neat handiwork, but there was something endearing about his determined effort. When the thread tangled for the third time, Kenneth's frustrated grunt set Miriam giggling again. She tried to stifle it behind her hand, but soon tears were rolling down her cheeks. "Not all of us have such delicate fingers," Kenneth grumbled, but his eyes were warm with shared amusement. As their laughter faded, a comfortable quiet settled over them. The fire popped and crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Miriam's face grew thoughtful, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the wooden table. "Back home," she said softly, "the men would laugh too. But not like this." She paused, gathering courage. "They would point and whisper about the fat Amish girl. Say no man would want such a wife unless he was desperate for land." Kenneth's hand stilled on her shawl. "Those men were fools," he said, his voice low and fierce. "My father said I should be grateful for any offer," Miriam continued, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam. "That I was lucky anyone would have me, being so big." "Miriam." Kenneth set down the shawl and reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. "Strength is nothing to mock. You've got strong hands for working, strong arms for carrying, strong legs for standing your ground. Any fool can be thin, but it takes something special to be strong." Miriam stared at their joined hands, her vision blurring with tears. But these were different tears than the ones of laughter earlier. These were for years of hurt finally being washed away by simple, honest words. The fire had burned low, needing feeding, but neither moved to tend it. They sat close together, the dying flames painting Miriam's face in soft gold and shadow. Kenneth found himself studying her features, the gentle curve of her cheek, the steady clarity of her eyes, the way the firelight caught in her lashes. When they finally bid each other goodnight, retiring to their separate sleeping areas, Kenneth lay awake for a long time. Usually, in these quiet hours, his mind would drift to memories of his lost family, his wife's smile, his children's laughter, the weight of their absence. But tonight, different images filled his thoughts. He thought of Miriam's hands in the garden's soil, sure and capable, the sound of her laughter echoing in the cabin's rafters, the way she'd looked at him across the table, trust and something more in her eyes. For the first time since losing his family, Kenneth fell asleep with hope in his heart instead of grief. In his dreams, he walked through summer meadows, Miriam beside him. Her hand was warm in his, her presence solid and real. There were no ghosts here, no shadows of what was lost, only sunshine and wildflowers, and Miriam's smile brighter than both. When dawn came, Kenneth woke with the memory of warmth still lingering. He lay quietly for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of Miriam starting her day, the scrape of the fireplace poker, the quiet humming of a hymn, the familiar creak of floorboards under her steady feet. Something had shifted between them, as subtle and significant as the changing of seasons. Like the seeds Miriam had planted, it was a beginning full of promise, reaching toward the light. The morning sun painted long shadows across the yard as Kenneth helped Miriam onto his mule. Her plain dress stretched tight across the saddle, but she settled herself with practiced grace, arranging her skirts modestly. Kenneth took the reins, walking beside them on the rutted road toward town. "Been meaning to get supplies," he said, his boots crunching on scattered pine needles. "Cabin needs more nails for that loose siding, and we ought to get extra seed for next season." Miriam nodded, her bonnet bobbing. "I was hoping to look at fabric. My everyday dress is wearing thin." She smoothed her skirt self-consciously. "If we can spare the money, that is." "Reckon we can." Kenneth's voice was gentle. "Trapped some fine pelts last week, should fetch a fair price." The journey took most of the morning. As they approached town, wagons and riders grew more frequent on the road. Kenneth noticed how Miriam's shoulders tensed at each passing group, though she kept her chin high. He walked a little closer to the mule, his presence steady and protective. The general store's bell jangled as they entered. While Kenneth sorted through bins of nails, Miriam drifted toward the fabric display. Her fingers traced the edges of cotton bolts, lingering over a sturdy brown material suitable for work dresses. The shopkeeper's wife watched with narrowed eyes but said nothing. "That's good cloth you're looking at." Miriam turned to find a woman in her 30s standing nearby. She recognized her as Sarah Klein, whose husband had died in a cattle stampede the previous spring. "It seems strong," Miriam replied softly. "It is." The widow's smile was kind. "I made my own dress from it last month." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I've seen you at church. Takes courage to walk in there with your head high, way some folks talk. But you do it anyway. That's worth something." Color rose in Miriam's cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Sarah Klein," the widow introduced herself properly. "If you ever need help with sewing or anything else, my place is just past the creek crossing." Before Miriam could respond, Kenneth appeared with his purchases. "Got everything we need," he said, then noticed Sarah. "Ma'am?" "Mister." Boone Sarah nodded to them both. "You've got a good woman here. Make sure you treat her right." Kenneth's expression softened as he looked at Miriam. "Yes, ma'am. I aim to." They left the store with nails, seeds, and 3 yards of the brown fabric. The afternoon sun had warmed the street considerably, and Kenneth suggested they get supper at the cafe before heading home. Miriam hesitated but agreed. The cafe was half full, mostly with ranchers and traders finishing their day's business. Conversations dimmed as Kenneth and Miriam entered. They found a small table near the back, Kenneth pulling out Miriam's chair with careful courtesy. When their food arrived, beef stew and fresh bread, Miriam automatically bowed her head to pray. Kenneth watched as she whispered her grace, aware of the stares from nearby tables. Some looked away in embarrassment when he met their eyes, but others kept watching, whispering behind their hands. A burst of raucous laughter drew their attention to a corner table where several men sat with whiskey bottles. One of them, red-faced and swaying, pointed toward Miriam. "Hey, mountain man," he called out, "how many acres did you get with that one? Must be worth a whole section, size she is." The cafe went silent. Kenneth's hand tightened on his spoon until his knuckles went white. Miriam sat perfectly still, her face pale but composed. The drunk continued, encouraged by his companion's nervous laughter. "Or maybe you're just scared of getting hungry up there in winter. Got yourself some extra?" Kenneth's fist slammed onto their table, making the dishes jump. He rose slowly to his full height, his chair scraping back with a sound like thunder in the quiet room. "That's my wife you're speaking of," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "A good woman who's shown more courage and dignity than you'll ever know." He took one step toward the drunk's table. "I suggest you close your mouth before I close it for you." The drunk's face went from red to white. He looked around for support, but his friends suddenly seemed fascinated by their plates. The man muttered something that might have been an apology and stumbled out of the cafe. Kenneth sat back down, his hand steady as he picked up his spoon. "Eat your stew before it gets cold," he said softly to Miriam. She nodded, blinking back tears. They finished their meal in silence while conversation gradually resumed around them. Kenneth paid their bill and helped Miriam outside, where evening was painting the sky in deep purples and blues. They were almost to the mule when Miriam touched Kenneth's arm. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for what you said in there. For defending me." Kenneth turned to face her, his expression serious in the fading light. "I only spoke the truth, Miriam. Nothing more." Something shifted in her eyes then, a deepening of trust that made Kenneth's heart beat faster. He helped her onto the mule and they started home, riding beneath emerging stars. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with new understanding. The moon rose as they traveled, casting silver light across the trail. Kenneth glanced occasionally at Miriam, noting how she sat straighter in the saddle now, as if some burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Her quiet strength moved him in ways he couldn't quite name. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices echoing off the mountains. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and sage. Kenneth walked close beside the mule, his arm sometimes brushing against Miriam's skirts. Each touch, though accidental, felt significant somehow. The cabin appeared ahead, a dark shape against the star-filled sky. As Kenneth helped Miriam dismount, their hands lingered together longer than necessary. She smiled up at him, moonlight catching in her eyes. "We should get inside," he said softly. "It's getting cold." Miriam nodded, gathering her purchased fabric close. They walked to the cabin together, their footsteps in perfect rhythm, bound by something stronger than words. The first snow of winter drifted down like scattered feathers, dusting the cabin roof with white. Kenneth stood in the doorway, watching the flakes swirl in the morning light. Behind him, Miriam stirred a pot of porridge hanging over the hearth fire, the wooden spoon making soft circles against the iron. "Storm's coming," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Best get more wood split before it hits proper." Miriam nodded, ladling the hot porridge into 2 tin bowls. "I'll help after breakfast. These hands aren't just for cooking." She flexed her fingers, which had grown stronger over the months of cabin work. They ate quickly, the fire crackling beside them. Kenneth noticed how Miriam's movements had become more confident in their shared space, no longer shrinking into herself as she had in those first weeks. Her presence filled the cabin with warmth that went beyond the physical heat of the hearth. Outside, the snow fell harder as they worked. Kenneth swung the axe in steady rhythm, the sharp crack of splitting wood echoing across the clearing. Miriam gathered the pieces, stacking them precisely against the cabin wall. Her cheeks grew rosy with effort, wisps of hair escaping her bonnet. "We'll need more than this," Kenneth said, pausing to catch his breath. "Winter up here bites deep." "Then we'll split more," Miriam replied simply, adjusting her shawl. "Show me how to use the axe." Kenneth hesitated, but something in her steady gaze made him nod. He demonstrated the proper stance, then helped position her hands on the handle. Her first swing went wide, making her laugh. The second connected, the log splitting with a satisfying crack. "Well done," Kenneth praised, surprised by the strength in her arms. They worked together through the morning, the woodpile growing steadily higher. By afternoon, dark clouds rolled in from the west. Kenneth led Miriam to the smokehouse where strips of venison hung from the rafters. "Need to make sure we've got enough dried meat stored," he explained, checking each piece carefully. "My mother taught me about storing food for winter," Miriam said, running her fingers along a strip of meat. "Though we never had venison. Just beef and pork." She paused, remembering. She'd sing hymns while she worked in the cellar. Said it made the time pass sweeter. Kenneth watched her face in the dim light, seeing both sadness and fondness in her expression. "You miss them? Your family?" "Parts of them," she answered softly, "the good parts. But not the shame they tried to make me carry." They moved on to the root cellar where Miriam had carefully stored carrots, potatoes, and turnips in beds of sand. Kenneth marveled at her organization, each vegetable placed just so to prevent rotting. Their hands brushed as they checked the stores, sending unexpected warmth through both of them despite the cellar's chill. Evening came early, as it did now in the shortening days. They sat by the fire, Miriam mending a shirt while Kenneth cleaned his rifle. The lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the wind whistled through the chinks they had yet to plug with mud and straw. Miriam's voice broke the comfortable silence. "Would you mind if I pray aloud?" she asked, setting aside her sewing. Kenneth lowered his rifle. "Reckon not," he said softly. "Been a while since I heard proper praying in this cabin." Miriam closed her eyes, her hands folded in her lap. "Dear Lord," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "thank you for this shelter, for food to store, for work to do." She paused, then continued more quietly. "And, Lord, if it be your will, send me a husband who won't turn away from me in shame, one who'll see me as you do, with loving eyes." Kenneth's heart thundered in his chest. The firelight played across Miriam's face, showing tracks of tears on her cheeks. Without thinking, he spoke. Maybe he already did. Miriam's eyes flew open, meeting his across the hearth. "Maybe," Kenneth continued, his voice rough with emotion, "he gave us to each other. Both broken in different ways, both needing mending." The silence between them vibrated with unspoken words. Miriam's hands twisted in her skirts, and Kenneth found himself holding his breath, waiting. But neither could find more words that night. They retired to their separate sleeping areas, Miriam on the rope bed, Kenneth on his pallet near the fire, both lying awake long into the night, hearts pounding with possibility. Days passed, filled with winter preparations and shy glances. One clear morning, Kenneth picked up his hunting bag. "Rabbits are fat this time of year," he said. "Good eating before the snow gets deep." "Could I come?" Miriam asked suddenly. I used to hunt small game sometimes back home, when Father wasn't watching." Kenneth's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he nodded. "Get your shawl." It's cold out there. They walked together through the frosted woods, their boots crunching on fallen leaves. Kenneth showed her how to spot rabbit signs, droppings, stripped bark, little paths through the undergrowth. Miriam proved an attentive student, her eyes sharp. When they spotted their first rabbit, Kenneth handed Miriam his spare rifle, a lighter one he used for small game. She handled it with unexpected familiarity, settling the stock against her shoulder. The shot cracked through the morning air, the rabbit fell clean. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Kenneth asked, impressed. Miriam smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "My brother taught me secret-like. Said everyone should know how to feed themselves, man or woman." Her smile faded slightly. "Father would have been furious if he'd known." "Your father was wrong about a lot of things," Kenneth said quietly. They hunted through the morning, Miriam proving herself as capable as any hunting partner Kenneth had ever had. Her aim was true, her movements quiet, her patience steady. By noon, they had 4 rabbits between them. Walking home, they found themselves laughing together, sharing the weight of the game bag between them. Miriam's cheeks were flushed with success and exercise, her eyes bright with joy. Kenneth found himself watching her more than the trail, nearly stumbling twice. That evening, as Kenneth cleaned the rabbits outside, Miriam's voice drifted through the cabin window. She was singing a hymn he didn't know, something about God's grace and mercy. The melody wrapped around him like warm wool, making his hands still over his work. Inside, he found her kneading bread dough, still singing softly. The lamplight caught gold highlights in her hair, and something shifted in Kenneth's chest, like a key turning in a long rusted lock. Later, after supper, while Miriam read her Bible by the fire, Kenneth took out his carving knife. The pine beam above the hearth had always been bare, unlike the other beams where his father had carved the family name years ago. Carefully, reverently, he began to carve. The letters took shape slowly. M-I-R-I-A-M. Each stroke of the knife felt like a prayer, a declaration, a promise. Miriam looked up at the sound of carving, watching him work. Neither spoke, but the air between them hummed with meaning. When Kenneth finished, he ran his fingers over the letters, feeling each curve and line. "There," he said softly. "Now you're truly part of this home." Miriam's eyes shone in the firelight. She reached up, touching the carved letters with trembling fingers. "Kenneth," she whispered, but couldn't find more words. The fire popped and sparked, sending shadows dancing across their faces. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin, warmth bloomed like spring flowers pushing through winter soil. The snow began falling heavier as December tightened its grip on the mountains. Thick flakes drifted down like feathers, covering the cabin roof in a white blanket that grew deeper by the hour. Inside, Kenneth stoked the fire while Miriam stirred a pot of bean soup, the warmth and aroma filling their small home. The peaceful evening shattered when hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Kenneth grabbed his rifle from beside the door, while Miriam's hands froze on her wooden spoon. Through frost-covered windows, they could make out the shapes of at least 8 mounted men, their forms dark against the snow. "Boone," a voice bellowed, "come out and talk." Kenneth recognized the railroad agent's voice. He turned to Miriam, his face grim. "Stay inside," he said softly. "No matter what happens." Miriam caught his arm. "Kenneth, please." "I mean it," he said, gentler now. "Whatever you hear, stay inside." He touched her cheek once, briefly, then stepped out into the snowy night. The railroad agent sat tall in his saddle, flanked by deputies wearing tin stars. Behind them, several rough-looking men shifted restlessly on their horses. Lamplight from the cabin windows caught the gleam of weapons. "Evening, gentlemen," Kenneth said, his rifle held low but ready. "Mighty cold night for a social call." The agent's face twisted into a sneer. "This ain't social, Boone. We've come for the cabin. Railroads pushing through here come spring, and we aim to clear the way." "This land's deeded proper," Kenneth replied steadily. "Bought and paid for at county auction." 10 cents ain't proper payment," one of the deputies spat. "Besides, railroads got prior claim. Government gave us rights to this whole section." Kenneth didn't move. "My wife holds deed to this land, legal and binding." The agent's laugh was ugly. "That fat Amish girl, the one who tried to hang herself, ain't nobody going to believe her claim over the railroads. Now step aside." Kenneth's finger tightened on his rifle's trigger guard. "You'll not speak of her that way," he said, his voice dangerous and low. "And you'll not take this land. Last chance, Boone," the agent warned. "Move or we move you." Inside the cabin, Miriam pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She watched in horror as 3 men dismounted, spreading out to flank Kenneth. "This is my home," Kenneth declared, "and I aim to defend it." The fight exploded in a blur of motion. Kenneth managed to slam his rifle butt into one man's face before the others were on him. They struck with fists and rifle stocks, driving him to his knees in the snow. Kenneth fought back hard, breaking one deputy's nose, but he was outnumbered. Miriam's scream pierced the night as she saw Kenneth go down under the blows. She rushed for the door, but Kenneth's voice, though pained, rang out clear. "Stay inside, Miriam. Don't come out." The beating continued until Kenneth lay still in the bloodied snow. 2 deputies grabbed his arms, hauling him toward their horses. The agent dismounted, walking toward the cabin door. Miriam backed away, her heart hammering. She grabbed Kenneth's spare rifle from beside the hearth, but her hands shook too badly to load it. Instead, she snatched the deed from its shelf and tucked it deep inside her Bible, hiding both beneath a loose floorboard. The agent pounded on the door. "Come morning, woman, this cabin better be empty. Railroad's taking possession. Legal-like." Through the window, Miriam watched them bind Kenneth's hands and throw him across a horse like a sack of grain. Snow swirled around the men as they mounted up, Kenneth's blood marking their path as they rode away. The night pressed in, terrible and vast. Miriam stood frozen until the last hoofbeat faded, then burst into action. She grabbed her heaviest shawl and Kenneth's spare coat, stuffing bread and dried meat into the pockets. Her hands trembled as she banked the fire, knowing she had to follow them to town. The walk was long and brutal. Wind cut through her clothes and the snow had drifted knee-deep in places. Miriam trudged on, her tears freezing on her cheeks, prayer after prayer rising like steam in the frigid air. "Lord, please," she whispered over and over, "don't let me be alone again." Not again. Lights from the town finally appeared through the swirling snow. Miriam's legs shook with exhaustion as she made her way down the main street. She saw neighbors peek through their windows, then quickly draw their curtains. No one met her eyes. No one offered help. The jailhouse squatted at the end of the street, its windows glowing yellow in the night. Through the glass, Miriam could see Kenneth slumped on a cot in one of the cells, his face bloody. The sight drove her forward, but a deputy blocked the door. "No visitors," he said flatly, "especially not for him." "He needs medical attention," Miriam pleaded. "At least let me tend his wounds." The deputy's face hardened. "He's charged with assaulting railway officials and resisting arrest. Could hang for that." He paused, his lip curling. "Best go on home, woman." "Oh, wait. You ain't got one anymore." Laughter drifted from inside the jail. Miriam stood straight, refusing to let them see her pain. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered. "I shall not want." "What's that?" the deputy demanded. "Nothing you'd understand," Miriam replied quietly. She placed Kenneth's coat on the jailhouse steps. "Make sure he gets this. Please." The deputy said nothing, but he didn't stop her from leaving the coat. Miriam turned away, her heart breaking at having to leave Kenneth behind. The wind had picked up, driving the snow harder now. She had no choice but to return to the cabin. It was too far to anywhere else, and the night was deadly cold. The trek back was even worse. Miriam's skirts were soaked and freezing, weighing her down. Twice she fell, struggling back to her feet through sheer determination. Her prayers became desperate whispers, carried away by the howling wind. When she finally reached the cabin, it was dark and cold as a tomb. No smoke rose from the chimney, no lamplight welcomed her home. Inside, the fire had died to cold ashes, and Kenneth's blood still stained the snow visible through the window. Miriam's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs. "Lord," she cried out, her voice echoing in the empty cabin. "Don't let me be alone again. Please, not again." The wind answered with a mournful whistle through the cabin's chinks. Miriam huddled in her wet clothes, shivering violently. The Bible concealed beneath the floorboard seemed to burn in her mind. Their only hope of keeping the land lay in those pages, in the deed her father had unknowingly given her as a tool of control, now transformed into their salvation. But salvation felt very far away as the night deepened around her. The cabin, once warm with shared labor and growing love, now felt as empty as it had been when she'd first tried to end her life here. Only now, instead of despair, determination began to take root in her heart. "I will not give up," she whispered into the darkness. "I will not let them win." Yet even as she made this vow, tears continued to freeze on her cheeks, and the night pressed in, cold and unforgiving, around the lonely cabin on the contested hill. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of pink and gold. Miriam stood before her clouded mirror, adjusting her prayer cap with trembling fingers. Her eyes were swollen from a night of tears, but determination had settled into her bones like iron. The cabin felt hollow without Kenneth's presence. No fire crackled in the hearth, no quiet humming as he whittled by lamplight. Miriam touched the empty chair where he usually sat, then squared her shoulders. She would not let grief paralyze her again. The walk to town seemed longer than ever. Her boots crunched through fresh snow, and her thick skirts grew heavy with dampness. As she approached the first buildings, Miriam heard the church bell tolling for morning prayers. Children playing in the street stopped their games to stare. A boy no more than 10 pointed at her, whispering loudly to his friends, "Look at how fat she is, like a stuffed flour sack." Laughter rippled through the group. Miriam kept walking, chin high, though each giggle cut like a knife. She remembered Kenneth's words. Strength is nothing to mock. The memory gave her courage to keep moving. Women clustered on the general store's porch fell silent as she passed. Their whispers followed her like shadows. "Poor fat fool," one said, not bothering to lower her voice, thinking a mountain man would want her. "Heard she tried to hang herself before he found her," another added. "Should have succeeded and saved everyone the trouble." Miriam's steps faltered, but she forced herself forward. The church stood ahead, its white painted walls gleaming in the morning light. Inside, the air smelled of pine boughs and lamp oil. Empty pews stretched before her like ribs in a wooden cage. Her knees struck the hard floor before the altar. Tears she had held back now flowed freely as she bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered, "I am not strong enough for this burden, but you are. Please, help me stand. Help me fight. Help me be worthy of Kenneth's trust." "Faith shines brightest in the darkest hours," a gentle voice said behind her. Miriam turned to find Pastor John Avery standing there, his weathered face kind. The circuit preacher had ridden through many storms to bring God's word to scattered homesteads and lonely cabins. "I heard about Kenneth's arrest," he said, settling onto the pew beside her. "The railroad's methods trouble my spirit deeply." "They mean to take everything," Miriam said, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "Our home, our land, our hope for a future together." The pastor nodded slowly. "Faith is tested when hope feels most distant. Like Job, we must trust even when we cannot see the path ahead." "But how can I fight them alone?" Miriam's voice cracked. "I'm just a woman they mock. No one will listen to me." "God chose David, a shepherd boy, to face Goliath," Pastor Avery reminded her. "He specializes in using the unlikely to accomplish his purpose." He patted her hand. "You have legal right to that land, and more importantly, you have truth on your side." Miriam straightened, drawing strength from his words. "Kenneth told me to protect the land. I must try, even if I fail." "That's the spirit," the pastor smiled. "Remember, the Lord helps those who stand for what's right. I'll speak to the sheriff about Kenneth's treatment." "Thank you," Miriam whispered, her heart lighter than it had been since Kenneth's arrest. She left the church with new resolve burning in her chest. The same women still whispered on the store porch, but their words seemed to bounce off her now like pebbles against stone. The jailhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark despite the morning sun. The same deputy from the night before stood guard, but this time Pastor Avery's words had fortified her courage. "I've brought food for my husband," she announced firmly. The deputy smirked. "Husband? That marriage ain't legal, woman, just a trick with paperwork." "The law says different," Miriam replied, her voice steady. "Now let me see him." Perhaps it was her tone, or maybe just the desire to avoid a scene, but the deputy stepped aside. 5 minutes, he growled. No more. The cell area smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. Kenneth sat on a thin cot, his face bruised and swollen, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Miriam," he breathed her name like a prayer as she reached through the bars, pressing fresh bread into his hands. "I couldn't bear to think of you hungry." Kenneth's fingers closed over hers, rough and warm and alive. "You shouldn't have come. It's dangerous." I had to, she whispered. The pastor gave me courage. Kenneth, I won't let them drive me away. I won't let them take what's ours. His grip tightened. Listen close, see, he said urgently. Don't let them take the land. Don't let them take you. Whatever happens to me, you stay strong. Tears rolled down Miriam's cheeks as she saw the truth in his eyes. He loved her. Not despite her size or her past, but completely, wholly, just as she was. Time's up, the deputy called, moving toward them. I'll fight for us, Miriam promised as guards pulled her away. I'll be waiting when you come home. Kenneth pressed against the bars, watching until she disappeared from view. Outside, Miriam paused to catch her breath, her heart so full it hurt. The walk back to the cabin seemed shorter somehow, despite the cold. As darkness fell, Miriam lit the lamp and placed it in the window, a beacon of hope in the gathering night. She retrieved the deed from its hiding place beneath the floorboard, pressing it to her chest as she sat in Kenneth's chair. I'm not alone, she whispered to the quiet cabin. God is with me. Kenneth believes in me, and I will not fail either of them. The lamp's flame danced, casting her shadow large against the wall. Outside, snow began to fall again, but Miriam sat straight and tall, no longer afraid of the dark or what tomorrow might bring. She would face whatever came with faith in her heart and Kenneth's trust to guide her. Hours passed as she kept her vigil. The deed remained clutched to her chest, its edges softened by her warm hands. Each crackle of the cabin's timbers, each whisper of wind made her think of Kenneth in his cold cell, but she forced herself to stay strong. When exhaustion finally overtook her, Miriam slept in Kenneth's chair, wrapped in the quilt they had mended together. The lamp burned steady in the window, a promise that love and faith could outlast any storm, any trial, any darkness that tried to overcome them. As she drifted off, Miriam's prayers were not of desperation as they had been the night before, but of gratitude and determination. She had found her strength, not in herself alone, but in the love of a good man, the wisdom of a faithful pastor, and the grace of a God who specialized in impossible victories. The deed rested safely against her heart as she slept, its presence a reminder that sometimes the tools of oppression could become instruments of liberation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Miriam knew with certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered town in shades of pearl and rose. Miriam stood before her clouded mirror, pinning her hair beneath her prayer cap with trembling fingers. The town meeting notice had arrived at first light, demanding all property holders attend to discuss the railroad's claims. She knew what waited for her there: mockery, disdain, the weight of countless stares. But Kenneth's words echoed in her mind. Don't let them take the land. The deed lay carefully folded in her Bible, wrapped in a clean handkerchief. The walk into town felt endless. Her boots crunched through fresh snow as she made her way down the main street. Store owners swept their porches, falling silent as she passed. A group of children stopped their play to point and whisper. The meeting hall stood at the town's center, its windows glowing with lamplight against the gray morning. Already, horses and wagons crowded the hitching posts outside. Miriam paused at the steps, gathering her courage. Ain't right, them railroad men throwing their weight around, a voice said beside her. Widow Sarah Klein stood there, her face kind beneath her bonnet. You going in? Miriam nodded, clutching her Bible closer. Well then, Sarah said, let's go together. Inside, the hall hummed with tension. Ranchers in dusty coats clustered near the pot-bellied stove. Merchants in their Sunday suits occupied the front benches. Deputies lined the walls, hands resting meaningfully on their gun belts. The railroad agent, Augustus Pierce, stood at the front table, spreading maps across its surface. His silk vest and gold watch chain marked him as a man used to having his way. Two lawyers flanked him like crows in black coats. Miriam and Sarah found seats near the middle, where Pastor John Avery nodded greeting. The room slowly filled until men stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Pierce rapped his knuckles on the table. This meeting will come to order, he announced, his voice carrying authority earned in Eastern boardrooms. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad claims right-of-way through parcels listed in these documents. All current residents are hereby notified to vacate within 30 days. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pierce continued. Fair compensation will be offered for legitimate claims, though most holdings in question were abandoned or obtained through questionable means. His gaze settled on Miriam, his lip curling slightly. Some properties were purchased for mere pennies at auction, clearly without proper authority. That auction was legal, someone called out. County approved? Pierce waved the protest away. The railroad's claim supersedes local arrangements. Progress cannot be impeded by squatters and speculators. Miriam's heart pounded. The deed felt heavy in her Bible, like a stone weighing her down. She thought of Kenneth in his jail cell, of their home with smoke rising from its chimney, of the life they were building together. Now then, Pierce said, those holding deeds to affected properties will surrender them for review. Compensation will be determined based on dash. No. The word escaped Miriam's lips before she could stop it. Heads turned, Pierce's eyes narrowed. I beg your pardon? Miriam rose slowly to her feet, her knees trembling beneath her heavy skirts. I said no. Young woman, Pierce said, his tone dripping with condescension. This is a legal proceeding. Please be seated. But Miriam felt strength flowing into her like spring water rising from deep wells. She opened her Bible and withdrew the deed, carefully unfolding it. This land, she said, her voice quaking at first, but growing stronger, belongs to me, by law, and I will not sell. The crowd shifted, mutters rising like wind through prairie grass. Pierce's face darkened. That document has no standing here. It has every standing, Miriam replied. She walked forward, her steps measured, holding the deed high. Filed first in Pennsylvania, then registered with your own county offices. The spring, the cabin, and 50 acres surrounding. All legally mine. One of the lawyers snatched the paper, scanning it with narrowed eyes. He whispered something to Pierce, whose face grew thunderous. This changes nothing, Pierce snapped. The railroad's authority cannot override legal ownership. Pastor Avery's calm voice cut through the tension. He stood, Bible in hand. Miss Zook's claim predates any railroad survey. The law is clear on this point. Pierce spluttered. This is absurd. Some immigrant girl cannot halt progress with a questionable deed. I ain't questioning it, Widow Sarah declared, rising to stand beside Miriam. That girl's worked harder than most men I know, making something of that land. Railroad wants to build? They can go around. Another woman stood, then another. Ranchers began nodding, remembering their own battles against Eastern money and power. The railroad will pursue this in court, Pierce threatened, gathering his maps with shaking hands. You'll regret this defiance. Perhaps, Pastor Avery said mildly, you should consider carefully before challenging a rightful claim in court. Judges tend to frown on corporate overreach, especially when it involves imprisoning innocent men to seize their property. The reference to Kenneth's arrest hung in the air like smoke. Pierce's face flushed dark red. This meeting is adjourned, he snapped, stuffing papers into his leather satchel. You'll hear from our attorneys. He stormed out, his lawyers scurrying after him like leaves in a wind. The deputies shifted uncomfortably, then filed out one by one. The crowd began to disperse, but many lingered to speak with Miriam. Hands patted her shoulder. Voices offered support. The widow Sarah hugged her tight. You done good, girl, she whispered. Real good. Pastor Avery approached, smiling gently. I believe I'll pay another visit to the sheriff about Kenneth's situation. A false imprisonment suit might persuade the railroad to reconsider their tactics. Miriam's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, she managed, all of you. She walked out into the winter dusk with her head high, the deed once again safe in her Bible. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes catching in her bonnet. The street looked different somehow, not hostile anymore, but almost welcoming. A group of women who had once whispered behind their hands now nodded respectfully as she passed. The children who had mocked her size watched with wide, wondering eyes as she walked by, straight-backed and dignified. Miriam thought of Kenneth waiting in his cell and felt hope rise in her chest like a dawn. She had done what he asked, protected their land, stayed strong. But more than that, she had found her own voice, her own courage. The cabin waited ahead, a dark shape against the whitening world. Soon she would light the lamp and set it in the window, a beacon calling Kenneth home. But for now, she savored each step of her walk, knowing she had finally claimed her place in this community, not as someone to be pitied or mocked, but as a woman of substance and worth. The deed rustled against her Bible with each step, no longer a burden, but a promise. God had not abandoned her. Kenneth had not lost faith in her. And now, at last, she had not failed herself. Word traveled like wildfire through the streets of Thunder Creek. By noon, everyone had heard about Miriam Zook's stand against the railroad. The tale grew with each telling, how the quiet Amish woman had faced down Augustus Pierce, how the pastor had stood beside her, how the mighty railroad's plans had been thwarted by a single deed. Outside the general store, men gathered in clusters, their breath frosting in the winter air, as they debated the morning's events. About time somebody stood up to those railroad men, declared Thomas Webb, adjusting his worn leather vest. Been pushing folks around too long. But Jeremiah Mills, the banker's son, sneered from his polished boots. You're all fools. That railroad means progress, means money, and you're letting some fat Amish girl hold it back? That girl showed more backbone than most, Sarah Klein cut in, her market basket heavy with supplies. And she's got the law on her side. The arguments rippled through town like waves on a pond. Some shopkeepers whispered that Miriam was ruining their chances for prosperity. Others praised her courage, remembering their own battles against Eastern money. At the cafe, Martha Chen set extra plates of stew aside. For the Boone woman, she told her husband. She'll need help, with Kenneth in jail. The jail itself squatted at the edge of town, its stone walls gray against the afternoon sky. Inside, Kenneth sat on his narrow cot, wincing as he touched the bruises left by rifle butts. His ribs ached, but his spirit remained unbowed. Deputy Wilson brought him water in a tin cup. Heard your wife caused quite a stir, he said, almost apologetic. Sheriff's in with the pastor now. Indeed, in the sheriff's office, Pastor John Avery stood before Tom Barlow's desk, his Bible tucked under one arm. The wall clock ticked steadily as they spoke. You know this imprisonment won't stand in court, Avery said quietly. The railroad men had no right to attack him on his own property. Sheriff Barlow rubbed his mustache. Pierce claims Boone drew first. And how many witnesses support that claim? The pastor's voice was gentle but firm. I have 12 members of my congregation who saw those men ride out armed for trouble. And now we have proof the land was legally Miriam's all along. He placed the deed copy on the sheriff's desk. Barlow studied it, his weathered face troubled. Pierce won't like this, he muttered. Pierce doesn't run this town, Avery replied, unless I'm mistaken about where your loyalty lies, Tom. The sheriff's chair creaked as he leaned back. Through his window he could see townsfolk gathering, waiting. Sarah Klein stood with Martha Chen. Thomas Webb and his sons lingered near the hitching post. And there, wrapped in her thick shawl, stood Miriam herself. She had walked from the cabin alone, her steps steady despite the cold. Now she waited, prayer book clutched in her hands, watching the jail's door. The dying sun painted the western sky in shades of purple and gold. Inside the sheriff's office, Barlow finally sighed. All right, John, you've made your point. He stood, keys jingling. I'll release him. But you keep the peace. You hear? God's peace passes all understanding, the pastor smiled, but I'll do my best. They walked to the cells together. Kenneth looked up as their footsteps approached. You're free to go, Boone, Barlow said gruffly. Charges are dropped. The cell door creaked open. Kenneth stood slowly, favoring his bruised side. Pastor Avery offered his arm for support. Your wife's waiting, he said softly. She's quite a woman, Kenneth. Together, they made their way through the jail's narrow corridor. The front door opened, letting in a rush of cold air and last light. Miriam stood in the street, her face pale but composed. When she saw Kenneth in the doorway, something broke inside her. She ran forward, her heavy skirts forgotten, and caught him in her arms. Kenneth stumbled slightly, then steadied himself against her solid warmth. His arms encircled her, drawing her close. They stood together in the gathering dusk, neither speaking for a long moment. You did it, Kenneth finally whispered into her hair. You saved everything. Miriam pulled back just enough to see his face, her eyes bright with tears and triumph. We did, she corrected gently. Together. Around them, the crowd shifted and murmured. Some turned away, still angry at progress thwarted. But others smiled, touched by the simple power of their reunion. Sarah Klein stepped forward, pressing a basket into Miriam's hands. Supper, she said firmly. You both need feeding up. Martha Chen appeared with a covered pot. Stew, she explained. For strength. More townspeople came forward. Thomas Webb with a sack of grain, the cooper's wife with fresh bread, even the blacksmith's boy with a bundle of kindling. Small gifts, but each one a declaration of support. Kenneth watched in wonder as Miriam thanked each person, her dignity unmarred by tears. This was not the frightened woman he'd found hanging from his cabin beam. This was someone stronger, someone who had found her place and power. Pastor Avery raised his hands in blessing. Go home now, he told them softly. Rest and heal. Hand in hand, Kenneth and Miriam started down the street. Their steps matched despite his limp, her strength supporting his weakness. The townsfolk watched them go, a couple transformed by trial into something unshakable. The walk home was slow but peaceful. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes catching in Miriam's bonnet and Kenneth's beard. Their breath mingled in the cold air as they spoke quietly of all that had happened. The railroad won't give up easily, Kenneth warned. No, Miriam agreed, but neither will we. They passed the last houses, following the road that led to their cabin. Ahead, the mountains rose dark against the star-scattered sky. Behind them, Thunder Creek's lights began to twinkle in windows. I prayed for you, Miriam said softly, every hour. Kenneth's hand tightened on hers. I felt it, he admitted. In that cell I felt, held up, like something bigger than myself was keeping me strong. God's love is like that, she smiled. It finds us even when we think we're lost. They walked on in comfortable silence, their footsteps crunching in the new snow. The basket of food swung gently from Miriam's arm, a reminder of newfound friendship in place of mockery. When they reached the cabin, smoke still rose from its chimney. Neighbors had kept the fire burning in their absence. Light spilled from the windows, warm and welcoming against the gathering night. On the threshold, Kenneth paused. Miriam, he said softly. She turned to face him, her cheeks pink with cold and happiness. Thank you, he whispered, for fighting, for staying, for... He gestured at the cabin, the land, everything they had built together. Miriam reached up and touched his bruised face with gentle fingers. Welcome home, she said simply. They crossed the threshold together into the warmth of their shared life, leaving footprints in the snow that would soon be covered by fresh powder, marking a new beginning in their journey together. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's wooden walls. Miriam set out 2 tin plates on the rough-hewn table, filling them with Martha Chen's hearty stew. The aroma of beef and vegetables filled the small space, mixing with the scent of fresh-baked bread from Sarah Klein's basket. Kenneth eased himself into a chair, his bruised body protesting. Steam rose from the bowls as they ate in comfortable silence, listening to the wind whispering through the pine boughs outside. The snow fell heavier now, white flakes swirling past the windows like dancing spirits. The pass will be sealed by morning, Kenneth said softly, breaking off a piece of bread. His eyes never left Miriam's face, watching how the firelight caught the curves of her cheeks, the gentle strength in her jaw. Then we're well provisioned for it, Miriam replied, gesturing to the townspeople's gifts spread across their counter. Her voice held a note of wonder at such kindness. When the bowls were empty, Kenneth rose slowly from his chair. Pain flickered across his face, but determination burned brighter in his eyes. He crossed to where Miriam sat and lowered himself carefully to one knee beside her. Her breath caught as he took her work-roughened hand in his. The firelight painted them both in warm gold as he searched for words that had been growing in his heart. The law made us husband and wife, Kenneth said, his voice rough with emotion. That paper bound us together when we were strangers. He paused, thumb brushing across her knuckles. But I choose you now, Miriam. Not because of any deed or document, but because of who you are. Tears spilled down Miriam's cheeks, catching the firelight like diamonds. Kenneth, she whispered, your strength, your faith, the way you face the world with such grace. His voice grew stronger with each word. I choose all of it. All of you. Miriam's free hand came up to cup his cheek, her touch gentle against the fading bruises. Their eyes met and held, speaking volumes in silence. Then Kenneth leaned forward and Miriam bent down, and their lips met in their first true kiss. It was soft and sweet, and tasted of tears and joy and promises kept. Not a kiss of duty or contract, but one born of faith and choice and love freely given. Outside, wolves began to howl in the snowy night, their wild voices echoing off the mountainsides. But inside the cabin, wrapped in firelight and each other's arms, a family was born. Two souls, once broken and alone, now merged into something stronger than either had dreamed possible. Spring sunlight streamed through the cabin windows as Kenneth worked steady strokes with his plane, shaping pine boards for Miriam's rocking chair. Wood shavings curled around his boots, while the sweet scent of fresh-cut timber filled the air. Outside, Miriam knelt in the warming earth, planting bright marigolds and purple wildflowers along the doorway path. "What do you reckon about the Miller boys?" Kenneth asked, testing the smooth curve of an armrest. "Pastor mentioned they need a home after their folks took sick." Miriam sat back on her heels, soil darkening her apron. 3 young ones, all needing love. Her face softened. "Our home's quiet no more if we take them in." "Reckon that's just fine by me," Kenneth smiled, his hands never stopping their careful work. Wagon wheels creaked up their path as Sarah Klein arrived with fresh-baked pies. Behind her came Tom Wesley, the banker who'd once mocked their union, now bearing gifts of seed and a mumbled apology. The railroad men's threats had faded like winter frost, their lawyers silenced by public support for the unlikely couple. Every week brought new friends. Miriam baked bread for 3 widows while Kenneth split cords of wood for veterans too old to swing an axe. Their cabin, once a symbol of loneliness, now stood as testament to dignity and mercy earned through faith and perseverance. Evening settled over the mountain valley like a soft blanket. Golden lamplight spilled through the cabin's window, casting warm shadows across the porch where Kenneth sat in the new rocking chair he'd crafted. The gentle creak of pine boards kept time with his slow rocking. Inside, Miriam's needle flashed in the firelight as she worked on small shirts and trousers. Her strong fingers moved steadily, stitching love into every seam. The clothes would wait patiently for the Miller boys, who'd soon fill their home with laughter and life. She hummed an old hymn, the melody drifting through the open door. Kenneth paused his rocking to listen, his heart full. Together, they gazed up at the stars dusting the dark sky, bright as diamond chips scattered on velvet. "This place," Kenneth whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "was worth more than 10 cents. It was worth everything." Miriam's hand found his in the darkness. "God turns small things into miracles," she replied softly. Their fingers intertwined as they sat together, warmed by the hearth's glow and each other's presence. Outside, the frontier stretched wild and harsh, but within these walls, faith and love shone like beacons in the night, a testament to second chances and God's endless mercy. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.